Hey everyone, so in this video I'm actually taking on not exactly a question on the forums, but something that was brought up, and it's just asking about what things actually stack. And this is a video that I was going to make sometime this week, so I'm kind of just speeding that ahead because I saw this on the forums. Because yes, I am back on forums. It's been like 3 or 4 months since I was last on them, but I think this could prove to be valuable to a lot of people because a lot of these abilities, well, it's difficult to track what stacks and what doesn't stack. And I think it's important that people understand before they end up getting or leveling up certain tunes or weapons on how something acts. Because knowledge is power to me, and I think it's just important that everyone understands the in-game mechanics. When you understand those mechanics, the game kind of becomes easier for you in some ways. So anyway, the first one we're going to be checking is bleed, and as we can see, it obviously does stack, and it's very easy to run a bleed team that way. You can get bleed up to be pretty high. Here I'm using S-Class Jason, and you can see just with 2 characters, and it's just 2-on-2, you can see how effective a bleed can be, and it's kind of nice to see that the rushes stack with bleed active skills and bleed weapons and other abilities. Like I'm running pain spread on Relito, which is why the bleed is going up so high. And I'm not looking to win the match here. I did because the opponent bled out, but it's just to focus on bleed stacking in the game. So this is an important one to remember and know because not everything does stack. So what we're going to be checking next is hemorrhage bleed, and specifically off of Wangfa's rush, because Wangfa has a special rush that applies bleed, crosshairs, as well as hemo bleed, I believe. We can see that when he rushes, he applies the 300 hemo bleed, and how hemo bleed works is that every turn it worsens by 150. So it's a pretty effective way in some areas of a game to accumulate bleed quickly, especially if you end up running some lacerators. But what we're checking here is if his rush will stack, and it actually does. So this is something that I didn't know before. I didn't know if the hemorrhage bleed would actually stack on itself, and there's one other scenario with hemorrhage bleed that I wanted to check on, and that would involve using tunes that have hemorrhage as their specialist skill. So Zac is a good example of this. And I'm just giving him a crit chance mod because hemorrhage bleed is triggered off of a critical hit. So we're going to try to apply the hemorrhage bleed first with Zac, and then try to apply it again to the same character. So we got the critical hit, so hemorrhage is applied. What we need to do to check is get another critical hit. Now, Zac ended up dying there for me, but it's not a big deal because I do have Rick that I can use to revive him. We can see that the application of Wangfa's hemorrhage does work on top of Zac's, which makes sense based on how Wangfa's worked on his own. But next, when we see how Zac attacks, Zac is going to get a critical hit, but the hemorrhage doesn't increase. So that's a pretty unique thing that we just witnessed. So hemorrhage bleed, does it stack? Kind of. So it stacks when it's applied by a rush, but not when it's by a specialist skill. So that's kind of interesting and unique. I'm not exactly sure if that is as intended. And now we're going to be checking healing over time. We're going to be using Frost, 2 of them actually, because when Frost rushes, it's 30% healing over 5 turns. So we're attacking with them first, command rushing Dr. Steven, so both Frost get their rush. And we're just going to prove that after one Frost rushes, 30% HP for everyone, multi-turn healing. The second one rushes, and it stacks. So that's actually pretty effective. It could be a great way to fight infection as a hard or soft counter in some ways. Like I've used that before with my Kate before, and I think it's a great method to combat infection, especially high amounts of infection, because you can stack this quite high, and it is a method that I have used in the past actually. The next thing that we're going to be checking is slow, so we're just using some red tunes that have slow applied as their weapons on a critical hit, and we can see that the Timothy's didn't add anything to it. We can also see that Olivia's slow overrode the small 33%, and that the 33% from those weapons could not override Olivia's 55%. So that's pretty reassuring actually, because we know that the highest value is going to be the one that counts against the enemy tune. The next ability that we're testing is Exhaust, and this is one that I think everyone kind of knows about. Exhaust does not stack. So we can see Angel applies 500, Leopo, her active skill is 300, it doesn't make 800, and Leopo does not override the 500, which is pretty helpful because we know that the highest amount will be applied. The one downside is that if you run both of these on a defensive team and they're both using their active skills on turn 1, then you're missing out on one of the toons using an attack, for example, unless one of the toons is dazed or something. And personally, whenever I see someone that has an Angel and Leopo on defense together, it kind of makes me happy because I know that they're just applying Exhaust on that first turn, and I don't have to worry about them attacking me, defense downing me, impairing me, stunning me, and so on. Next, we're moving on to Trauma. I recently did a video on Trauma, so I'm pretty sure you guys already know that Trauma does stack. This is as intended, so it's pretty easy to get Trauma to be a pretty high number. I'm just using some 6 stars because their active skills just work faster than other toons at the moment. So we can see that both Zhai Fang's, they'll stack, and once we use Kyle's active skill, we're going to see that Trauma increase again. So lots of abilities here that are able to stack. I'm kind of enjoying this type of video by explaining how something acts, or at least how it's supposed to act, I guess. So I'm hoping you guys are finding this video to be informative and helpful. Like, this is the type of video that I actually find a lot of fun in doing because I get to test real things out to see the application of it. And one of the last things to test out is Burn. Naya applies 400 Burn, Roxy overrides it with her 1000, so you can see that Burn does not stack. And I think everyone kind of knew this one as well, but it's always nice to check out and see, to kind of like verification or validation of what you think you know, at least. And the very last ability that we're going to be checking to see if it stacks or not is Infection. And this is a bit of a tricky one because no, Infection does not stack, and we're going to see that in the video because we're using Mateo and we're using Minerva. Minerva applies, I think it's 175% Infection. Well, we'll see in a second. But Mateo does 15% for 3 turns. But when we end up using Minerva, what we notice is that her Infection overrides Mateo's, which isn't exactly ideal, especially when you're trying to speed through a team. It kind of means that if you don't have the same amount of Infection being applied, you could end up almost giving the enemy an extra turn. Now, something that I've used in raids before and war is attacking a toon like the Trader, getting myself infected for 25%, but if I'm running fast healing, or let's say I even have a lifesteal mod, and I recover 1% of the infection, theoretically, and actually this is what has happened, I can attack the Trader again, and it'll reset me at 25% because 25% is higher than 24%, and it's for those 2 turns, which aren't really 2 turns anyway. I am going to touch base on that in a different video, but it's kind of interesting that you can manipulate Infection to a point. And I think that's also important to know in the game, how to manipulate certain abilities for your own advantage. Now, before I end this video, I saw another interesting thing on the forums, and you know what? I'm going to be frequenting the forums a bit more to find these types of questions because I love to answer these. So a pain spread weapon copies a negative debuff to an adjacent enemy. They're asking if it works with bleed, crosshairs, and hemorrhage. Now bleed, I know it does because that's how I stack bleed really fast. Crosshairs, absolutely. I've seen it happen before. Now hemorrhage is the interesting one because as we saw, hemorrhage sometimes stacks and sometimes doesn't. So this is something I'm actually going to test out. To answer the rest of this question, it copies the current bleed that is on the character. So say we have 1000 bleed applied to toon A, and we attack with Zhai Fang, who has pain spread, 500 bleed on her weapon, and she's a lacerator. What's going to happen is she'll pain spread the 1000 bleed to a different target, an adjacent one, but her target will be lacerated from 1000 to 2000 bleed, and then her special weapon would add 500 bleed, and if there was a bleed mod, it would also come into play here. but the laceration happens after the pain spread, but before the weapon and the mod. And now to the good stuff. This confused me at first. I wasn't sure what I was seeing, but we see there's hemorrhage, and then all of a sudden, Clementine has 150 normal bleed. So it seems like whenever hemobleed is pain spread, it's being applied as a regular bleed for a single turn. Now, frankly, I have no idea if this is correct behavior or not. I answered on the forums that I wasn't sure if this was as intended, and I decided not to share on there yet just because I was making this video, but this one really baffles me because I don't see a reason why it couldn't be hemo, for example, because we take a look at how Wangfa, his hemobleed, can stack, so why wouldn't it in this case? This is just completely unique and different to me, and I'm very happy that this question was asked in the forums. Anyway, thank you everyone for watching and listening to my video.